The morning Fannie Fletcher entered the Dodge City Livestock Contest as a joke. She had flour on her hands, dirt on her boots, and absolutely nothing left to lose. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Kansas plains had turned the color of old copper, the grass lying flat under a sky so wide and blue it could make a person feel very small and very alive at the same time. Fannie had been both those things in equal measure since the day she buried her husband Robert 18 months prior, laid him down in the red clay behind the barn, while the neighbors watched with their hats pressed to their chests and their eyes full of pity that she had no use for. Pity did not fix fence lines. Pity did not feed the chickens or convince a stubborn bull to cooperate on a cold morning. Pity, as Fannie had come to understand it, was just another word for something people gave you instead of help. She was 31 years old, which some folks in Dodge City seemed to think was the sort of age at which a widow ought to have already made arrangements to become someone else's wife again. The suggestions had started coming before Robert's grave had fully settled, offered up with cheerful casualness by neighbors and storekeepers and the Reverend's wife alike, as though grief were something that had a reasonable expiration date, and Fannie was simply choosing to ignore hers. She had ignored all of it, every suggestion and sidelong glance and well-meaning plate of food left on the porch, and had instead thrown herself into keeping the Fletcher ranch from collapsing entirely around her ears. She had not done a perfect job of it. The honest truth was that the Fletcher land, some 400 acres of rolling Kansas grassland with a creek running through the east corner, was in considerably worse shape than it had been when Robert was alive. Robert had been a steady, methodical man who understood cattle and weather, and the precise way that hard work compounded over years into something resembling prosperity. Fannie had understood those things too, in theory, but she had been the one who managed the household accounts and the garden and the chickens and the occasional hired hand situation, while Robert handled the heavy lifting of the cattle operation itself. Now she was trying to do all of it, and she was managing, but only barely, and the word barely was doing a great deal of heavy lifting in that sentence. She had 12 head of cattle remaining from the original herd of 30, plus a small collection of chickens, 2 horses, and one particularly opinionated goat, named Harriet, who had decided that the kitchen garden belonged to her, and conducted daily raids with the focused determination of a military general. Fannie had sold the rest of the cattle to make it through the first winter, and then through the dry summer that followed, and now with autumn coming on she was facing the arithmetic of the thing squarely, and finding that the numbers did not add up the way she needed them to. Which was how she had ended up standing in front of Lyle Prentice's hardware store on the main street of Dodge City on a cool October morning, reading the notice that had been pinned to the board outside the door with 2 rusty tacks and a confidence that it deserved to be seen. The notice read, in letters that someone had clearly taken care with, that the 3rd annual Dodge City Livestock Exhibition and Contest would be held on Saturday, October 19, 1878, on the fairgrounds at the edge of town, and that categories would include Best Bull, Best Dairy Cow, Best Breeding Pair, and the Grand Champion Livestock Award, which carried with it a prize of $100 and a blue ribbon wider than a man's hand. Entry fees were $2 per category, and all entries were to be submitted to the contest secretary, one Mr. Augustus Weller, no later than Friday noon. $100. Fannie stood there in the morning light and read those words again. $100 was the difference between making it through the winter with some margin and not making it at all. $100 was the price of 3 months' worth of supplies, or a new section of fence line along the south pasture where the old one had rotted through, or any number of things that she needed desperately and could not currently afford. She had a bull. His name was Caesar, and he was 3 years old and built like a boulder that had decided to become animate, with a deep red-brown coat that caught the light in a way that even Fannie, who had plenty of other things to think about, could admit was beautiful. Robert had bought Caesar as a yearling and spent 2 years working with him, and the bull was calm enough that Fannie could move around him in the pasture without incident, which was not something she could say about every bull she had ever encountered. He was, by any reasonable measure, a very fine animal. The problem was not the bull. The problem was that the Dodge City Livestock Contest was the kind of event where men like Clayton Hargrove and his sons came with their prize cattle and their prize attitudes, and collected their ribbons while everyone clapped, and the women stood at the side tables pouring lemonade. Clayton Hargrove ran the biggest cattle operation in Ford County, and had won the Grand Champion award both previous years running, and the idea of Fannie Fletcher walking onto those fairgrounds with her one remaining bull and putting him up against Hargrove's prize animals was, by any reasonable accounting, ridiculous. She stood there for another moment, looking at the notice, and then she laughed. It started small, just a soft exhale of air through her nose, and then it grew into something real, a genuine laugh that surprised her with its own existence, because she had not laughed that way in a long time. It was absurd. It was completely absurd, and she was going to do it anyway. She went home and spent the afternoon cleaning Caesar up until he shone. The fairgrounds on the western edge of Dodge City occupied a flat stretch of land that had been cleared and fenced off years ago for exactly this sort of purpose. And by the time Fannie arrived on the morning of October 19th, leading Caesar on a rope halter with a clean red ribbon braided into his forelock that she had stayed up past midnight tying, the place was already humming with activity. Men in their best hats moved between the livestock pens, evaluating animals with the focused squinting expression that men in Kansas seemed to cultivate as naturally as they cultivated wheat. Women in bright calico moved between the food tables that had been set up along the north fence, and somewhere near the east end, someone was playing a fiddle that sounded slightly out of tune but enthusiastic. Fannie led Caesar through the entrance gate and found Mr. Augustus Weller's table, and the look on Augustus Weller's face when she told him she was entering Caesar in the best bull category, and the Grand Champion category was, she thought, worth every cent of the $4 she handed over. Augustus Weller was a small, precise man who wore his mustache with an air of personal investment in its appearance, and he looked at Fannie, and then at Caesar, and then at Fannie again, and his pen hovered over the entry ledger for just a beat too long before he wrote her name down with the careful neutrality of a man who had been raised to be polite even when he was genuinely startled. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said. "Welcome." "Thank you, Mr. Weller," she said, and led Caesar toward the bull pens with her chin level and her eyes forward. The whispers started almost immediately. She could hear them the way you hear creek water when you are walking through tall grass. Not specific words at first, but the unmistakable sound of people talking about something they find either remarkable or improper. And in Fannie's experience, those two things were often the same. She caught fragments as she passed. The Fletcher widow. Robert's ranch. Is that seriously her bull? She ignored all of it with the practiced ease of a woman who had been ignoring what people said about her for the better part of 2 years. What she did not ignore, because it was difficult to ignore something that was standing directly in front of Caesar's pen and looking at him with an expression of frank professional assessment, was the man. He was tall, which was the first thing she noticed. The kind of tall that required some architectural adjustment to fit through most doorways, with broad shoulders that stretched his denim shirt in a way that suggested they were not especially interested in being contained by fabric. He had dark hair that wanted to curl at the ends where it touched the collar of his shirt, and a jaw that was clean-shaved in a way that indicated he had made some effort for the occasion. And when he looked up from assessing Caesar and noticed Fannie looking at him, she saw that his eyes were the color of good river water in summer, deeply, clearly green. He was not young, not that callow, barely grown sort of young that made Fannie feel obscurely maternal and tired. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, with the kind of face that had lived in it, weather and work, and some experience of the harder varieties of living written into the lines at the corners of his eyes. "That is a very fine bull," he said, and his voice matched the rest of him, low and steady with something warm underneath it. "I know," Fannie said. He looked at her for a moment with what she could only describe as appreciation, not the romantic kind necessarily, though perhaps that too, but the kind that recognized a person who knew what they had and was not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of modesty. Then he extended his hand. "Jeremiah Hale," he said. "I have the Hale Ranch about 12 miles southeast of town." "Fannie Fletcher," she said, and shook his hand. His grip was firm, and his hand was calloused the same way hers was, from rope and fence wire and the general daily business of keeping a livestock operation alive. "I know the Fletcher land," he said, and there was something careful in how he said it, the way people sometimes spoke about things that were associated with loss. "Robert Fletcher ran a good operation." "He did," she said, and waited for the part where he told her it was a shame she was out here doing this alone, or offered some well-intentioned suggestion about what she ought to do with the land. That part did not come. Jeremiah Hale just looked back at Caesar and said, "He has exceptional conformation. The depth through the chest is remarkable. Who bred him?" And Fannie found herself standing at a livestock pen at the Dodge City Livestock Contest, having an actual conversation about cattle with a man who was treating her like a person with useful knowledge, which was, she thought, one of the more unexpectedly pleasant things that had happened to her in some considerable time. She told him about Caesar's breeding, about the bull Robert had bought him from over in Barton County, about the particular care Robert had taken with his development, and the traits he had been selecting for. Jeremiah listened with the full attention of someone who was genuinely interested, asking questions that were specific and intelligent, and somewhere in the middle of all of it Fannie realized she had forgotten to be tense. The contest itself began at 10 o'clock, when a large man named Horace Tillman climbed onto a wooden platform at the center of the fairgrounds and informed the assembled crowd that the judging would commence. The crowd pressed in around the judging ring, which was a roped-off oval of bare ground in the middle of the fairgrounds, and the animals were brought in one category at a time, while two judges walked around them with clipboards and expressions of weighty deliberation. Clayton Hargrove arrived at approximately this same moment, which could not have been accidental timing, driving his prize bull into the fairgrounds on a lead held by one of his hired men, the animal's red and white coat brushed to a gloss, and his hooves black to a shine. Hargrove himself was a big man, red-faced and loud in the manner of men who had made enough money to believe that volume was a legitimate substitute for argument. He swept the fairgrounds with a proprietary gaze and landed on Fannie with an expression that moved through several stages before settling on something between amusement and dismissal. "Well now," he said, loudly enough that the people nearby could not have missed it even if they had wanted to. "Robert Fletcher's widow entering the bull contest. That is one for the history books." Several people laughed. Not everyone, but enough that the sound of it reached Fannie and pressed against the back of her teeth in a way that she refused to let reach her expression. She straightened her spine another degree and looked at Clayton Hargrove with a pleasantness so complete it could have cut glass. "Good morning, Mr. Hargrove," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a dismissal, and was entirely condescending, and moved on with the air of a man who had already moved on from something that barely registered. Fannie did not look at Jeremiah Hale to see if he had watched this exchange. She looked straight ahead at the judging ring and waited for her category to be called. What happened in the following hour was something that the people of Dodge City, Kansas would talk about for a long time afterward, embellishing it slightly with each retelling in the way that genuinely surprising events tend to accumulate embellishments as they pass through time. The best bull category was called, and the animals were brought into the ring one at a time. Clayton Hargrove's bull was genuinely impressive. There was no denying it. a large and well-formed Hereford with the structural soundness and visual presence of an animal that had been raised with exactly this moment in mind. The crowd murmured appreciatively when he was brought in. The judges made notes. Then Caesar came in, led by Fannie in her clean calico dress and her good boots, and the murmuring changed quality without stopping. Caesar walked into that ring the way he did everything, with the calm self-possession of an animal that had nothing to prove, his deep chest catching the morning light and his wide forehead, and straight back presenting themselves with an utter indifference to the occasion that somehow read as dignity. Fannie kept the rope easy in her hand and walked him around the ring at a measured pace, and the judges looked at him for a long time, writing things on their clipboards with an intensity that suggested they were writing more than they had written about the previous animals. When the judging was complete, and Horace Tillman climbed back onto his platform to announce the results, the crowd pressed forward the way crowds do when they sense that something interesting is about to happen. Fannie stood near the ring's edge with Caesar's rope in her hand and breathed carefully through her nose. The best bull ribbon, Horace Tillman announced, went to Caesar, owned by Mrs. Fannie Fletcher of the Fletcher Ranch. The silence that followed was the specific kind of silence that happens when an audience is collectively recalibrating its expectations. It lasted approximately 3 seconds, and then it broke into something that was partly applause and partly the sound of many people talking at once. And in the middle of all of it, Fannie Fletcher stood very still and felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been clenched for a year and a half suddenly releasing its grip by the smallest possible degree. She accepted the blue ribbon from one of the judges with a steady hand, and a thank you that she meant absolutely. Clayton Hargrove's expression was the color of a bad sunset, all red and building toward something. He said nothing, which took more effort than saying something would have, and it showed. The Grand Champion category was the last event of the morning, and by the time it was called, the entire fairgrounds had reorganized itself around the question of whether the Fletcher widow's bull was going to do the impossible thing twice. Fannie brought Caesar into the ring again, and this time the crowd was quiet in a different way, the way of people who are paying serious attention to something that has captured their interest entirely. The judging took a long time. The two judges walked around Caesar and around Hargrove's bull with clipboard scrutiny applied in equal measure, and they conferred with each other twice in voices too low to hear, and the entire fairgrounds held something approaching collective breath. Horace Tillman climbed onto his platform and looked at his papers, and then at the crowd, and then at his papers again. And Fannie thought that if he did not speak soon, she was going to lose the careful neutrality she had maintained all morning through sheer force of will. The Grand Champion Award for the third annual Dodge City Livestock Exhibition, Horace Tillman said, with the air of a man who was aware that he was delivering news that would be discussed for some time, went to Caesar, owned by Mrs. Fannie Fletcher. Nobody laughed. The applause that followed was real and widespread and surprised its own participants. Even some of the men who had laughed at Clayton Hargrove's earlier comment were clapping now, with the slightly sheepish energy of people adjusting to having been wrong about something. The woman next to Fannie, who turned out to be the wife of one of the local cattle buyers, grabbed her arm and said, "Wonderful," with the emphatic warmth of someone who had wanted exactly this result. And through the crowd, moving toward her with deliberate purpose and an expression that was fully, warmly open in a way she had not expected to see on a face she had only just met that morning, came Jeremiah Hale. "That," he said, arriving at her side with his hat in his hand and the river water eyes very bright, "was one of the finest showings I have seen at this contest in 3 years of attending it." "Thank you," Fannie said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended, partly from the effort of maintaining composure through all of it, and partly because something about the way he was looking at her was making her aware of herself in a way she had not been in a long time. "You should know," he said, "that Hargrove is not going to take this quietly." "I did not expect him to," she said. "I took his trophy." Jeremiah looked at her for a moment, and then he smiled, and it changed his whole face in the way that a real smile does when it is not something a person does reflexively, when it is something that has to be earned, and therefore means more for the earning. "Can I bring you a piece of pie?" he asked. "The Methodist women always have excellent pie at these things, and I believe that winning a grand champion ribbon entitles you to at least 2 pieces." She laughed. It was the second time in recent days that she had laughed in that way, the real way, and it still surprised her. "I believe you are correct," she said. They ate pie at one of the long tables along the north fence, while the afternoon settled into the comfortable disorganization of the post-contest fairgrounds. People moving between the food tables and the livestock pens, and the little cluster of vendor stalls that had set up along the east side. Jeremiah asked her about the ranch with the same specific, interested quality he had brought to their first conversation, and she found herself telling him things she had not told anyone, about the struggle of the past 18 months, about the arithmetic of survival that she ran in her head every morning before the sun was fully up, about the way she had sold cattle one by one like selling pieces of something she was trying to keep intact. He listened without the careful, pitying stillness that most people brought to listening about difficult things. He listened like someone who had been through some version of difficulty himself and recognized the texture of it. "What happened to your operation?" she asked at one point because it seemed fair since he knew about hers. He was quiet for a moment, turning his pie fork over in his fingers. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Fever. We had been building the ranch together for 7 years before that." He paused. "It took some time to figure out what I was doing it for after she was gone." "Did you figure it out?" Fannie asked, and then felt as though the question might be too direct, too far inside the perimeter of a man she had known for half a day. But he did not seem to find it too direct. He looked at her with a straightforwardness that matched her own. "I think I am still in the process," he said. The conversation moved to other things, the state of the Kansas cattle market, the dry summer just past, and what it meant for winter feed supplies, the particular merits of different fence wire gauges that had just become available through the hardware store. It was, on its surface, a conversation about practical ranch things, but underneath it was something else. The kind of conversation two people have when they are discovering that the other person is interesting in a way they did not fully anticipate. The kind where every ordinary question is also a way of finding out more. It was mid-afternoon when Clayton Hargrove found them. He came with 2 of his hired men flanking him in a way that was probably meant to be imposing and was instead mainly rude, and he planted himself at the end of the table with his thumbs in his belt and his face still carrying that bad sunset color. One of the hired men was young and trying to look dangerous, and the other was older and looked like he would rather be somewhere else entirely. "Mrs. Fletcher," Hargrove said, "I want to have a conversation about the judging today." "I imagine you do," Fannie said. She did not put down her fork. "I have been talking to Weller, and I believe there are some questions about whether the contest rules permit a woman to enter in her own name." The table went quiet in the way that meant other people were listening while pretending not to. Fannie looked at Hargrove steadily. The notice posted outside Prentice's hardware store contained no language about who was and was not permitted to enter, she said. It listed the categories, the entry fee, and the deadline. "I met all 3 requirements." "The intent of the contest," Hargrove said, and his voice had the weight of a man who was accustomed to his intent being treated as law, "has always been for cattle operations." "I run a cattle operation," Fannie said. "Caesar is my bull. I entered him. He won." "I want a review of the judging," Hargrove said, and now he directed this at the general vicinity rather than specifically at Fannie, the way men sometimes did when they wanted to make a point without making it to the person they were making it about. Jeremiah Hale set down his fork with a quiet precision that was somehow louder than if he had slammed it. He looked at Hargrove with an expression that was entirely pleasant and entirely immovable. The judges made their decision based on the animal, he said. I watched both animals in the ring, and their decision was correct. Caesar is a finer bull than yours by the standards this contest uses. Those are the facts, Clayton, and I expect you know them. Hargrove looked at Jeremiah the way men look at other men who have said true things they did not want to have said. You stay out of this, Hale. You brought your conversation to a public table, Jeremiah said. That makes it everyone's conversation. There was another beat of the particular kind of silence this afternoon was generating. Then Hargrove's older hired man put his hand on Hargrove's elbow, a small gesture, the kind that means let it go, and Hargrove pulled his elbow back, but he also, eventually, walked away. The younger hired man gave Jeremiah a look that was meant to be threatening and was mostly just young, and then followed his employer. Fannie exhaled slowly through her nose and looked at Jeremiah, who had picked up his fork again with the composure of a man who had not found the exchange especially dramatic. You did not have to do that, she said. No, he agreed. But it was the truth, and the truth seemed useful here. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light had that particular golden quality of October in Kansas, warm and slightly melancholy, the kind of light that makes things look the way they will when you are remembering them. It was, she said. Thank you. He walked her to where Caesar was penned when the afternoon was winding down, and helped her check the bull's feet in water before she prepared to take him home. They stood side by side at the pen rails with the easy comfort of two people who have been talking long enough that silence has started to feel natural between them, which was, Fannie thought, a rather remarkable thing to have achieved in a single afternoon. I would like to call on you, Jeremiah said. He said it without preamble and without the slightly sideways approach that some men used for the question, as though saying it directly would somehow make it more refusable. He just said it the way he said other true things. Fannie looked at the wide Kansas sky above the fairgrounds, the blue of it beginning to deepen toward evening at the edges. She was 31 years old and had not allowed herself to think about this kind of thing since Robert died, had kept her mind on the practical arithmetic and away from the territory of what she might want for herself if wanting were something she permitted. She thought about that now, briefly, for the first time. Saturday next, she said, if the weather holds. His smile came back, the real one. Saturday next, he agreed. She drove Caesar home with the 2 blue ribbons folded carefully in her pocket, and $100 in prize money in the envelope that Augustus Weller had handed her with the same careful neutrality with which he had written her name down that morning. And the drive home across the Kansas grass in the cooling afternoon was one of the better 40 minutes she had spent in recent memory. She hung the blue ribbons on the wall of the barn where Robert's tools still hung, and she looked at them for a long time in the lantern light before she went inside to make supper. The following week had the quality of normal life with something changed underneath it, the way a piece of music you have heard many times sounds different when someone has altered a single note. Fannie did her usual work, mended the south pasture fence line that had been troubling her, turned the garden, checked the cattle, argued with Harriet the goat about the kitchen herbs. She settled the accounts that the prize money made possible and felt something that she recognized after a moment as relief, clean and specific. The relief of a problem solved rather than merely postponed. Saturday came with clear skies and a cold edge to the air that smelled of winter arriving to investigate its options, and Fannie was in the kitchen making coffee when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road. Jeremiah Hale rode a bay mare that moved with the neat efficiency of an animal well matched to her rider, and he came down the road toward the Fletcher ranch house with the ease of a man who had been on horseback long enough that horse and rider had become a single operating unit. He wore a clean shirt and had made the same careful effort with his shaving that she had noticed at the fairgrounds, and he was carrying something draped over his arm that turned out, when he dismounted and came to the porch, to be a folded piece of canvas. I heard you had a section of fence trouble on the south pasture, he said. She looked at the canvas and then at him. How did you hear that? Tom Weller mentioned it at the general store. He does the supply deliveries out this way. He held out the canvas. I had some extra good fencing canvas from a repair I did last month. It seemed like something useful. Fannie stood on her porch and looked at this man who had brought her a practical gift because he had heard she had a problem and had, with absolute simplicity, thought to do something about it. It was the kind of gesture that did not try to be romantic and was therefore more romantic than most things that made the effort. "Come in," she said. "I have coffee on." They drank coffee at her kitchen table and talked about the fence situation, and then about other things, and Harriet the goat pressed her face against the kitchen window with the determined nosiness of an animal who had decided that all activities occurring near the kitchen required her oversight. Jeremiah looked at the goat and then at Fannie, and there was a warmth in his expression that she felt somewhere central to herself. "Her name is Harriet," Fannie said. "She has opinions." "I can see that," Jeremiah said. He went to the window and looked at Harriet directly, and Harriet looked back at him with her yellow goat eyes. And whatever the two of them communicated in that exchange seemed to result in a mutual accommodation, because Harriet eventually withdrew from the window with the dignity of a creature that has made a decision rather than been displaced. They went out after coffee, and Jeremiah looked at the fence situation on the south pasture with the same professional attention he had brought to evaluating Caesar, assessing the problem and suggesting a repair approach that was both simpler and more durable than what Fannie had been planning. He did not take over. He offered the suggestion and then waited to see what she thought of it, and when she said she thought it was a good approach, he helped her implement it with the comfortable functionality of two people who have worked alongside each other before, which they had not, but which felt somehow familiar anyway. They worked until the light began to go, and when it was done they stood at the fence line looking at the south pasture where the cattle moved slow and dark against the copper grass, and Jeremiah said, "This is good land, Mrs. Fletcher." "Fannie," she said. They had been working together for 3 hours, and Mrs. Fletcher had the feel of a formality that no longer quite fit. He looked at her with that openness. "Fannie," he said, and something about the way he said her name, carefully, as though it was something he wanted to say correctly, made her look away toward the cattle for a moment to give herself somewhere to put the feeling. He came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and on the 4th Saturday he arrived to find her in the middle of a situation with Caesar that had elevated significantly from manageable to alarming in the space of about 20 minutes. The bull had got into the north pasture, where the new feed had been stored, and had eaten considerably more than he should have, and was showing the signs of it, agitated and uncomfortable, and not cooperating with Fannie's attempts to get him settled. Jeremiah assessed the situation in approximately 3 seconds, stripped his coat off, and went to work. They spent the next 2 hours managing Caesar through it together, Jeremiah calm and competent, and speaking to the bull in the low, steady voice that worked, while Fannie did the things that needed doing with the same unruffled focus. And by the time Caesar was settled and grazing peacefully in the smaller paddock, and they were both leaning against the paddock rail exhausted, and somewhat the worse for the experience, the sun had gone down entirely, and the stars were out over Kansas in their full autumn abundance. "I am sorry about your shirt," Fannie said. There was something on his shirt that she was not going to specify. "Ranching," he said simply, in the tone of a man who has made his peace with the occupational realities. She laughed, and he did too, and in the dark at the paddock rail with the stars overhead and the cattle moving quiet in the grass and both of them tired from the particular satisfaction of a difficult thing handled well together, the laughter ran through her like warmth running through a cold house, reaching the rooms that had been closed for a long time. "Stay for supper," she said. "It is the least I can do." He stayed for supper, and then for the conversation that followed supper, and it was well past proper visiting hours when he finally stood up and took his hat from the hook and said he ought to get back. Fannie walked him to the door, and they stood in the doorway with the cold night air coming in from outside and the warm lamplight behind them, and Jeremiah Hale looked at her with the river water eyes very serious. "I find that I think about you," he said. "I find that I think about you considerably more than I think about most things, and I want you to know that." The words settled over her like the October air, clear and exact and not asking anything, just offering the truth of themselves. "I find myself thinking about you as well," she said, which was also the truth, and which she found she could say without the complicated feeling she had expected, the guilt and the confusion and the sense of transgressing something that had already ended. It was just true, and she could say it. He nodded once the way he did when something was confirmed. "Saturday next," he said. "Saturday next," she agreed. He came back Saturday next, and the Saturday after that. And by November the visits had extended from one afternoon to a full day of working the ranch together, because the ranch needed the work, and because they both recognized that the combination of their skills and effort made things go considerably better than either of them working alone. He knew cattle in ways she was still learning, and she knew the Fletcher land's particular temperament and the management of the smaller animals and the household arithmetic that kept the whole operation in balance. And together the ranch began to recover the ground it had been losing. But it was not just the work, and they both knew that. It was the conversation that accompanied the work, and the silences that accompanied the conversation, and the way that spending a day in each other's company had started to feel like the most natural possible arrangement of a day. It was the way he noticed things, the precise specific way he paid attention to whatever was in front of him, whether it was a sick animal or a difficult fence situation or Fannie herself when she was talking, that quality of being truly seen by someone who was genuinely interested in what they were seeing. On a cold Saturday in November, with the first frost having laid itself across the Kansas ground overnight, and the sky the pewter color of coming winter, they were working to move a stored hay supply from the barn loft to the lower section, where it would be easier to access when the snow came. And Fannie was on the ladder and Jeremiah was below receiving the bales, and there was something easy and rhythmic about the work. And at one point she reached for a bale at an awkward angle and lost her footing on the ladder for a single alarming instant, and his hands were there, at her waist, steadying her before she had fully registered that she was falling. She regained the ladder and stood still for a moment with his hands still at her waist, warm through her coat, and the world was very quiet except for the sound of wind against the barn boards and the cattle moving below and her own heartbeat doing something she paid attention to. "You are all right," he said, and it was not quite a question. "Yes," she said, and was surprised by how much she meant it, by how broadly the word was true in this moment at the top of the ladder with his hands steady at her waist, and the frost-colored morning outside the barn door, and everything that had been wrong in the last 2 years still wrong but somehow not the whole picture anymore. She climbed down the ladder and he did not move his hands until she was on the ground and steady, and when she turned around they were very close, close enough that she could see the way the cold had put color in his face, close enough that there was a quality to the air between them that had been building for weeks and had now arrived at some kind of precipice. "Fannie," he said. "Jeremiah," she said. And then his hands came up and cupped her face with a gentleness that seemed to come from some deep place in him, careful and certain at the same time, and he looked at her for one full moment as though he wanted to be sure, as though this was something he intended completely and did not want to do accidentally, and then he kissed her. It was a soft kiss, not tentative exactly, but careful, the kind of first kiss given by someone who understands that a first kiss is a significant thing and treats it accordingly. His mouth was warm and his hands were gentle at her face, and the cold November air was all around them, and the barn smelled of hay and horses, and Fannie felt something in her chest complete itself that she had not known was incomplete. When they separated, which was after a moment that she did not want to count because counting it would make it finite, he looked at her with an expression that was, she thought, about as fully open as a human face could be. raw and honest and a little afraid, in the way that being completely honest about something important is always a little frightening. "I should have done that several Saturdays ago," he said. She laughed, the good laugh, the real one, and he did too, and the tension of the precipice moment dissolved into something warmer and more sustainable. "Yes," she said, "you should have." The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that a person, looking back on them later, recognizes as the time when everything changed for good. Jeremiah came not just on Saturdays now, but on Tuesdays and Thursdays as well, and sometimes on the weekdays between. And the Fletcher Ranch, with its 12 head of cattle and its one opinionated goat, and its 2 horses, began to function with the efficiency and purpose of an operation that had found its footing again. The south fence held. The cattle were in good condition going into winter. The hay supply was adequate and properly stored. The chickens produced eggs with the regularity of animals who had decided that their circumstances were acceptable. Fannie watched all of this happening and felt it not as a rescue, which she would have resisted, but as a partnership, which was something else entirely. She had not needed Jeremiah to save her operation. She had been keeping it alive alone and could have continued to do so. What Jeremiah brought was not salvation, but amplification. The way that 2 people working together on something they both care about can create results neither could produce alone. He brought her to the Hale Ranch on a Tuesday in late November, saying he wanted to show her what he was working on and wanting her opinion. And she rode out with him across 12 miles of Kansas grassland that lay silver and brown under a sky crowded with gray clouds promising snow. And when the Hale Ranch came into view, she understood immediately what she was looking at. It was a well-built operation, the house solid and the barn in good repair and the fence lines clean, with somewhere in the range of 60 head of cattle visible in the main pasture. But there was also a loneliness to it, an echo quality that she recognized because her own place had it too, the quality of a home that had been planned for more people than it currently contained. There were decisions left incomplete, projects half begun, rooms that had probably been intended for something that had not happened. He walked her through it with the same combination of pride and clear-eyed honesty he brought to everything, showing her the things that were working well and the things he was still figuring out. And she gave him her honest opinions, which he received the way he always received true things she told him, as information he wanted rather than criticism he needed to manage. They were standing at the corral fence with the cold wind in their faces and the cattle moving solid and calm in the field beyond when Jeremiah said, without particular preamble, "I have been thinking about the future." She looked at him. "What aspect of it?" "The primary one," he said, and turned to look at her with the full directness she had come to know as simply the way he communicated when something mattered. "I want to marry you, Fannie. I want to combine the operations and raise the herds together and spend the days the way we have been spending them, because those days are the best days I have had in years, and I believe they could be the best days for a long time to come if we are willing to say so out loud." The Kansas wind moved through the dry grass, and the cattle lifted their heads, and the gray sky pressed down close, and Fannie Fletcher stood at the corral fence of the Hale Ranch, and felt the question like a key finding a lock. She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the early mornings when she was doing the arithmetic of the ranch and found, underneath the numbers, the deeper arithmetic of what she wanted. She had thought about the way he looked at her. She had thought about the way 18 months of hard and lonely work had felt different in the weeks since he came into it. Not easier exactly, but inhabited differently, shared. She had thought about the way she felt when she heard hoofbeats on the road and knew they were his. "You should know," she said, "that Caesar comes with the arrangement, and Harriet." He looked at her steadily. "I have made my peace with the goat." "She is a trial," Fannie said. "Most worthwhile things are," he said. She looked at the Hale cattle in the field, at the solid house behind them, at this man who had shown up at a livestock contest, and looked at her bull with honest respect, and then looked at her with the same thing, who had brought fence canvas because he heard there was a problem, who had kept his hands at her waist until he was sure she was steady. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment as though confirming the word was the one he hoped it was. "Yes," he said. "Yes, Jeremiah," she said, "I will marry you." He took her hand in both of his with the same careful certainty that had characterized all his dealings with her. And there, at the corral fence with the cold November wind and the gray clouds, and the cattle looking on with their wonderful bovine indifference, Fannie Fletcher said yes to the future. They were married in December, on a Saturday because it seemed right that it should be a Saturday, at the small white church in Dodge City, with the Reverend conducting the ceremony and a modest assembly of people who had watched the whole story of the autumn unfold and were genuinely pleased about how it had resolved. Mary Sutton, who ran the dry goods store on Main Street with her husband and who had become one of Fannie's first actual friends in Dodge City, stood with her as witness. The Methodists, who bore no ill will toward anyone who could win a livestock contest, had provided a quantity of food for the reception that was considerably more than the assembly required, which in Fannie's experience was exactly the right amount. Clayton Hargrove did not attend. Nobody had expected him to. Augustus Weller came and shook Fannie's hand with the warmth of a man who had, over the months since October, revised his initial careful neutrality into something considerably more enthusiastic. "I am glad," he said, which seemed to cover several things at once. The ceremony was short and the words were the right ones, and when Jeremiah turned to look at her as she came up the aisle on her own, which she had chosen to do, and his face did the thing it did, the thing where everything in him was entirely open and entirely glad, she felt the same key-and-lock feeling she had felt at the corral fence, but deeper and more permanent, like something that had been in solution suddenly crystallizing into a solid form. They were married, and then they went home to the Fletcher ranch for the night because the decision about which ranch they would consolidate on was a practical one that required more conversation than they had managed in the busy preceding weeks. And that night the December stars were very bright over Kansas, and the air was cold and clean. In January, they made the practical decision together, the way they made all their decisions, with both of them at the kitchen table with the ranch papers and the land maps spread out, and the coffee getting cold beside them as they talked through the logistics with the honest efficiency of two people who trusted each other's judgment. The Fletcher land had the better water, with the creek through the east corner and the deeper wells. The Hale land had the better grass density and the larger barn structure and the established herd of 60 head. The question was which to consolidate and which to lease out, or whether to work both operations as a combined entity under shared management. They chose the latter. They hired a man named Tom Briggs, a quiet and capable 30-year-old who had been working as a hand on neighboring ranches for years, and who turned out to be the kind of worker who makes the difference between an operation that functions and one that thrives. Tom took primary responsibility for the Hale land's daily operation, while Jeremiah split his time between both properties, and Fannie managed the combined accounts and the livestock schedules and the household with a thoroughness that made the numbers look considerably better than they had been looking for some time. Caesar remained at the Fletcher land, which Fannie had renamed the Fletcher Hale Ranch on the sign at the gate, and was put to work as a breeding bull for the combined herd with results that bore out everything the Dodge City Livestock judges had decided about him. Harriet the goat moved her territorial operations to a larger and more diverse garden, which she clearly considered an upgrade. Spring came to Kansas the way it always does there, not gradually but in a rush, the grass greening up fast after the snow withdrew, and the air warming with the specific urgency of a season that has been waiting. They planted the kitchen garden together, debating the merits of different planting arrangements with the same earnest specificity they brought to pasture management. And Fannie grew something she recognized only slowly as happiness, not the bright acute kind but the sustained ordinary kind, the kind that is made of accumulated days rather than isolated moments. In April, Jeremiah came home from the Hale land one evening with a particular expression that Fannie, after 4 months of marriage, was beginning to be able to read. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at his coffee, and then at her with a combination of satisfaction and something more serious underneath it. "I had a conversation with Hargrove today," he said. Fannie set down the account book she had been working in. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where he made an offer on the Hale land," Jeremiah said. "He has been wanting to expand east and our property is exactly where he wants to go." He paused. "The offer was fair, better than fair." Fannie looked at him steadily. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I would discuss it with my wife," Jeremiah said. "She appreciated that." "She appreciated it considerably. And what do you want to do?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The money from the sale would let us invest significantly in the Fletcher Hale operation here. Better breeding stock, infrastructure improvements, the south acreage expansion you have been wanting. We would be a stronger operation with a focused investment than spread across 2 properties." He looked at her. "But it is Hargrove, and I want to know how you feel about that." Fannie thought about Clayton Hargrove and his bad sunset face, and the way he had stood at that table at the fairgrounds, and tried to dismiss her with the comfortable certainty of a man who had never been wrong about who mattered and who did not. She thought about what it would mean to sell land to him. "He will pay fair value," she said. "He will pay what I ask," Jeremiah said, with a quiet certainty that meant he was not going to let the transaction go otherwise. "Then sell him the land," Fannie said, "and use every cent of it to build something better than he thinks we can build." Jeremiah smiled at her across the kitchen table with the full warmth of that smile, and she felt it the same way she always did, as something that reached the parts of her that had been cold for a long time. "That," he said, "is exactly what I intend to do." The sale was completed in May, and the money was invested exactly as they had discussed: new breeding stock that complemented Caesar and the existing cows, a proper barn expansion at the Fletcher Hale land that tripled their covered storage capacity, and the south acreage expansion that added 80 acres of excellent grassland to their operation. They hired a second hand to work alongside Tom Briggs, a young man named Elias who was 17 and about to turn 18, the son of a farming family 2 counties over who had come looking for work with the serious, quiet energy of someone who intended to be useful and was. By the summer of 1879, the Fletcher Hale Ranch had grown into one of the more prosperous small cattle operations in Ford County, with a herd of 80 head, and a reputation for well-bred animals that owed something to Caesar's ongoing contributions, and more to the careful, knowledgeable management that Fannie and Jeremiah brought to every aspect of the operation. And it was in the summer of 1879 that Fannie understood she was going to have a baby. She sat with the knowledge for several days, turning it over, examining it from all its angles, which was what she did with important information. She had been married to Robert for 8 years and no children had come, and she had made her peace with that possibility in the way that people make peace with things that are beyond their management, which is to say imperfectly but functionally. She had not expected this to be different. She told Jeremiah on a July evening when the Kansas sun was going down red and gold over the western grass, and they were sitting on the porch with the day's work done, and the cooling air coming off the creek in the east. She said it simply, as she said most things, and watched his face. What happened on Jeremiah Hale's face when his wife told him they were going to have a child was something that Fannie thought she would carry as long as she lived, the way a very bright light leaves its impression on the back of the eyes even after you look away. It moved through shock and joy and something profound that she could only call wonder, all of it completely unconcealed and unmanaged, and when he reached for her hand across the porch bench his own hand was not entirely steady. "Fannie," he said, and stopped. "I know," she said. He brought her hand to his lips and held it there, and they sat together on the porch while the Kansas sunset did everything it knew how to do, and the grass turned gold and the cattle moved slow and dark in the field, and the world felt very large and very full. "Are you well?" he asked. "You feel well?" "I feel very well," she said. "I feel entirely well." "Good," he said. "Good." He was still holding her hand. They told Tom Briggs and Elias the following day, which was necessary because certain adjustments to the work distribution needed to be made in a reasonable and non-patronizing way, and both men received the news with warm congratulations and the quiet practical recalibration of people who understood that this was good news for the whole operation. Jeremiah's management of the information was thorough and somewhat endearing. He reorganized the fence repair schedule so that the heaviest work happened when he could be present. He made modifications to the kitchen that Fannie did not ask for but found herself grateful for, a better arrangement of the heavy storage containers, a second chair for the porch that was wider and more comfortable. He rode into Dodge City and had a conversation with Dr. Harmon, the physician, and came back with information that he delivered to Fannie not as instructions, but as information he had gathered on her behalf, which she could do with as she thought best. "You got that from Dr. Harmon?" She said. "He was helpful," Jeremiah said. "He said you are to tell him if anything seems wrong, and that otherwise you are a healthy woman in good circumstances, and he has no particular concerns." "That is exactly what I would have told you," Fannie said. "I know," he said. "I went to confirm it." She looked at him across the kitchen and felt the deep interior gladness of being known, of being with someone who understood the difference between caring for a person and managing them, and who had made that understanding a practice rather than an occasionally achieved accident. "Jeremiah," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said, which was a thing she had said to him before and which she said now with the particular weight of meaning it completely. Not as a courtesy or an offering, but as a statement of accurate fact. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands with the same gentleness as that November morning in the barn, and looked at her with everything in him available for seeing. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since you walked into that livestock ring with your bull and looked at Clayton Hargrove like he was a minor inconvenience you had already accounted for." She laughed, and he kissed her, and outside Harriet the goat was making known her opinions about the state of the kitchen garden fence in a voice that carried considerable conviction. The summer deepened into autumn, and the 4th annual Dodge City Livestock Contest notice went up outside Prentice's hardware store, and this year the notice had been modified to specify explicitly that entry was open to all registered livestock owners in Ford County, which Augustus Weller told Fannie, with some satisfaction, had been added specifically following the events of the previous year. She entered Caesar again, and he won again, which surprised nobody this time, and she accepted the blue ribbon and the second $100 prize from the judges with a composure that was entirely genuine because, this time, she had not been worried. Clayton Hargrove entered a different bull this year, and lost again, and this time he did not come to find anyone at the food tables afterward. He stood at the ring edge for a moment after the announcement, and then walked away with the bearing of a man who was in the process of revising something about the way he understood the world, which was, Fannie thought, probably a useful process for him, even if it was not a comfortable one. The winter of 1879 came in with some force, the first significant snowfalls arriving in November, and the temperatures dropping to the kind of cold that made the Kansas plains feel very honest about what they were, an enormous space with nowhere to hide from the weather. The Fletcher Hale ranch was prepared for it. The hay supply was adequate, the cattle healthy, the barn properly insulated against the cold, and the house warm with the particular warmth of a well-maintained home and a good stove, and enough firewood cut and stacked to see out any reasonable version of the season. Their son was born on a night in February of 1880 when the snow was deep enough on the Kansas ground to muffle all sound, and the sky was clear and crowded with stars. And Dr. Harmon arrived from Dodge City in enough time to be useful, which everyone agreed was the relevant metric. Fannie worked through the labor with the same focused determination she brought to difficult problems, and Jeremiah was present for the whole of it in the way that not all men were present for such things in 1880, holding her hand and being steady in the way that was his particular gift. And when Dr. Harmon placed a small, loud, emphatically alive boy in Fannie's arms, the sound that Jeremiah made was something she kept in the same place as the expression on his face when she had told him they were expecting. They named him Robert James Hale. The Robert was for Fannie's first husband, which Jeremiah had suggested without being asked, with the simple generosity of a man who understood that honoring what had come before did not diminish what was present now. The James was for Jeremiah's father. Robert James Hale was an extremely decided baby from the first hour of his existence, with opinions about his arrangements that he expressed with great clarity and considerable volume, and he grew into an extremely decided small boy with the same characteristics amplified by mobility and increasing vocabulary. He had Jeremiah's green eyes and Fannie's copper hair, and the combined determination of both his parents, which his parents found occasionally exhausting and entirely delightful. Tom Briggs married a woman named Clara in the spring of 1880, a schoolteacher who had come to Dodge City to fill the position at the town school, and the event was celebrated at the Fletcher Hale Ranch with a gathering of neighboring families that filled the yard and went long past dark. Elias, now 18 and working the ranch with a skill and reliability that had made him indispensable, danced with Clara's younger sister with a seriousness that suggested he was conducting a thorough evaluation. Caesar won the Dodge City Livestock Contest Grand Championship for a third consecutive year in October of 1880, which the local paper wrote about in a way that used the phrase dynasty, and which Fannie found both accurate and slightly excessive. She accepted the ribbon and the prize money with the equanimity of a woman who had made her peace with being consistently right about her bull. By 1882, the Fletcher Hale Ranch had grown to 140 head of cattle, with a reputation for quality breeding stock that had attracted buyers from 2 counties over. They had 3 hired hands now, Tom Briggs and Elias, and a man named Gus who had come west from Missouri with good skills and a history he kept to himself, which Fannie and Jeremiah respected as his to keep. The ranch house had been expanded, a new wing added to accommodate the growing requirements of a household that included an extremely active 2-year-old who treated all horizontal surfaces as potential launching pads. And on a spring evening in 1882, Fannie told Jeremiah she was expecting again, which produced the same response as the first time, which was to say complete and transparent joy mixed with the expression of a man who was genuinely astonished to have been given so much. Their daughter came in November of 1882 and was named Eleanor, which was Jeremiah's mother's name, and she arrived into the world with the same decisive volume as her brother, but added to it a quality of focused attention even in infancy, watching everything around her with enormous dark eyes that suggested she was gathering information. Young Robert James, who was 2.5, examined his sister with the thoroughness of a person conducting due diligence on a significant acquisition and declared her acceptable, which was high praise from someone of his particular standards. The years that followed were the kind of years that make up a life, not dramatic in themselves but substantial in their accumulation, full of the texture of daily work and daily affection, and the particular joy of watching children grow into themselves against the backdrop of land you have worked and loved and made into something. They were not without difficulty. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the ordinary crises of livestock and machinery, and the unpredictable human complications that arise in any enterprise involving multiple people working closely together. There was one terrible season in 1884 when a fever moved through the cattle and cost them 20 head before they could contain it. And the financial recovery from that took 2 years and required the kind of patient, methodical work that both of them were good at, but which tested their reserves. Through all of it, Fannie and Jeremiah Hale worked their land and raised their children, and built their life together with the same quality of partnership that had been present from the beginning. Two people who had chosen each other with clear eyes and were daily reconfirming the wisdom of the choice. Harriet the goat lived to a remarkable age and retired from active garden raiding in approximately 1883, though she retained her opinions until the end and made them known whenever the spirit moved her. When she finally died on a warm afternoon in April of 1884, Fannie sat with her for a while in the yard and thought about the beginning of things, about flour on her hands and a livestock contest notice pinned to a hardware store board with 2 rusty tacks, about the particular stubborn absurdity that had carried her through the worst of the 18 months before everything changed. She did not cry exactly, but she sat with it, giving the moment what it deserved. Jeremiah found her there and sat down beside her without asking what she was thinking about, which was one of the things she loved most about him, his capacity to be present without requiring explanation. The Dodge City Livestock Contest continued to be an annual event, and Caesar continued to be entered until he was 7 years old, at which point Fannie decided that a bull who had won 5 grand championships had earned the right to attend to his breeding duties without the additional obligation of competitive exhibition. His sons and daughters populated the Fletcher Hale herd and several neighboring operations, and the reputation of the Fletcher Hale breeding program was such that people came specifically to purchase from them, which was a satisfying development in the life of a woman who had walked into her first livestock contest as a widow with nothing to lose. Robert James, at 6 years old, began following Jeremiah around the ranch with a focused dedication that was one of the most purely enjoyable things Fannie had ever witnessed, asking questions in the relentless way of a child who genuinely wants to understand how everything works. Jeremiah answered all of them with the same full attention he brought to everything, treating no question as too small or too obvious, and the relationship between father and son was one of the quiet joys of Fannie's daily life, something she watched with the warm attention of a person who knows they are looking at something good. Eleanor, at 3, had decided that the chickens were her particular domain and conducted their management with an efficiency that would have been remarkable in someone 3 times her age. She gave each chicken a name and kept track of their individual personalities and laying habits with a specificity that suggested a natural aptitude for the kind of detailed record-keeping that Fannie herself had always excelled at. On an October evening in 1885, the autumn light doing its particular copper-gold performance across the Kansas grass and the cattle settled in the fields and the children in bed and the ranch quiet around them, Fannie and Jeremiah sat on the porch in the chairs that had been there since the first year, watching the stars come out one by one over the plains. "I was thinking today," Jeremiah said, "about the livestock contest." Fannie looked at him. "Which one?" "The first one," he said, "October 1878, the look on Weller's face when you handed over your entry fee." He smiled at the memory, the slow, real smile. "I was in the barn area when you came in with Caesar, and I thought, whoever that woman is, she knows exactly what she has." "I did know," Fannie said. "I had cleaned him up for 3 days." "It showed," he said. "He was magnificent." He paused. "So were you." She looked at him sideways, the way she sometimes did when he said things that were better than she expected. "You are becoming sentimental in your middle years," she said. "I have always been sentimental," he said, with complete equanimity. "I was just more restrained about it before you gave me sufficient reason to be otherwise." She took his hand, which was large and warm and calloused from the same daily work that had calloused her own, and they sat together on the porch of the ranch that they had built from the pieces of 2 incomplete things into something whole and enduring. And the stars over Kansas were very bright, and the grass moved in the evening wind with the sound of something that had always been there and would continue to be. "Jeremiah," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad I went to that contest," she said. "For the joke of it, I am glad I went." He turned to look at her with the river water eyes full of everything that 7 years had built between them, and he raised their joined hands and pressed her knuckles briefly to his lips. "So am I," he said. "So am I." The prairie wind moved through the October grass, and the stars continued their slow turning over the plains. And in the house behind them, their son was dreaming whatever 6-year-old boys dream about. And their daughter was sleeping with one hand probably resting on whatever she had decided needed protecting. And the cattle were settled, and the horses were easy in the barn, and the accounts were in good order and the fence lines were sound. And Fannie Fletcher Hale sat on her porch in the autumn of 1885 and felt the full weight of a life that was exactly what it ought to be. She had come to that livestock contest as a widow with a prize bull, and a sense of the absurd and $100 standing between her and a winter she could not afford. She had left it with a blue ribbon and $200, and the beginning of something she had not expected and had not known she needed until it was already happening. Nobody had laughed when she won. And the world that had grown from that particular ordinary, extraordinary October morning was one she would not have traded for any of the easier paths the years might have offered, not 1 acre of it, not one day. She squeezed Jeremiah's hand, and he squeezed back, and the stars went on burning over Kansas the way they always had, indifferent and beautiful, witnesses to nothing and everything at once.